Going no contact with an avoidant ex reveals patterns that books and theories can describe, but only direct experience truly illuminates. The 90-day journey through complete silence creates a predictable psychological arc in the avoidant that unfolds with almost textbook precision. Yet experiencing it firsthand brings insights that abstract understanding cannot provide. This isn't a story about manipulation or winning someone back. It's a documentation of what actually happens when an avoidant's familiar patterns meet sustained boundaries, when their assumption of endless availability confronts genuine disengagement, and when their defensive confidence encounters consequences they've never faced before. Understanding this 90-day timeline reveals why shorter periods of silence rarely create genuine impact, how the avoidant's internal experience transforms through distinct phases, and why their eventual response, whether it comes or not, provides clarity about their capacity that their words during the relationship never could. This is what 90 days of complete no contact revealed about avoidant psychology, regret, and the tragic timing that defines their attachment pattern. Days 1 to 10, relief masking, hidden anxiety masking. The first 10 days of no contact produced exactly what I expected on the surface, but something more complex underneath. My avoidant ex's public-facing behavior suggested relief and vindication, increased social media activity, visible socializing, subtle signals of thriving and independence. The silence I maintained clearly registered as the space they'd been claiming to need, validating their narrative that the relationship's demands were excessive, and that freedom would restore their equilibrium and happiness. But beneath this surface confidence, small behavioral leaks revealed different internal experience. Their social media activity, while frequent, had quality of performance rather than genuine joy, carefully curated images of independence that seemed designed to convince audience and themselves rather than simply document actual experience. The timing and nature of posts suggested someone working to prove something rather than someone naturally content. During this first phase, my avoidant ex displayed what I now recognize as checking behavior disguised as coincidence, suddenly appearing in places where they might encounter mutual friends who would report back to me, liking old posts from months prior that would notify me of their activity, viewing my stories within minutes of posting despite claiming not to care about my life. These behaviors revealed someone whose stated indifference contradicted their actual hypervigilance about whether I was okay, whether I was moving on, whether I was already seeing someone else. The relief they experienced during these first days was real, but built on faulty assumptions. They assumed my silence was temporary upset that would resolve into my usual pursuit. They expected me to break and reach out within days, as I had during previous periods of distance. My continued silence past the point where I normally would have re-engaged began creating cognitive dissonance. This silence felt different, but they hadn't yet recognized why or what it might mean. What I didn't realize at the time but recognized later was that their relief during these initial days was also laced with subtle anxiety they couldn't yet acknowledge. The absence of my usual emotional availability, no messages to ignore, no needs to manage, no pursuit to deflect, created a strange void where their defensive patterns normally engaged. They were like a boxer whose opponent didn't show up to fight, leaving them shadowboxing against nothing. This absence of the familiar dynamic I'd provided, even though they'd claimed to want freedom from it, registered as unsettling rather than purely liberating. Their nervous system, calibrated to manage my presence and pursuit, struggled to recalibrate to my complete absence in ways they wouldn't consciously recognize for weeks. I also noticed during this phase that their checking behaviors had a compulsive quality that contradicted their surface confidence. They weren't just casually keeping tabs. They were actively monitoring my every move with intensity that suggested someone trying to reassure themselves everything was proceeding according to their expectations. Each time I posted something, they viewed it within minutes. Each mutual friend who saw me received subtle interrogation disguised as friendly catch-up. This hypervigilance revealed someone whose confidence was paper-thin, requiring constant reassurance through surveillance that I was still emotionally invested enough to eventually break the silence. The surveillance itself proved they weren't as indifferent as they wanted to appear. Days 11 to 30. Confusion, replacing confidence. The second phase emerged as my silence extended beyond their unconscious timeline for when I should have reached out. Their public behavior shifted subtly but noticeably. The performance of thriving became less consistent. Social media posts decreased in frequency, and the carefully curated happiness gave way to more ambiguous content. Song lyrics about missing someone, vague posts about complicated feelings, content that suggested someone processing emotions rather than celebrating freedom. During this phase, their checking behaviors intensified. Mutual friends reported being asked casual questions about how I was doing, whether I'd mentioned them, what I'd been up to. These questions were framed as polite interest, but the frequency and specificity revealed someone increasingly anxious about my state and whether I still cared. The fact that I hadn't reached out wasn't being interpreted as respect for their stated needs, but as potential indication I'd genuinely moved on. My avoidant ex also began what I call door-checking behaviors, small attempts to test whether I would respond if they created opening. An ambiguous text that could be interpreted as accidental, commenting on a mutual friend's post where they knew I'd see it, mentioning to people who would likely tell me that they'd been thinking about things. These weren't direct communication attempts, but they were testing whether the door remained open without having to risk the vulnerability of knocking directly. The confusion during this phase stemmed from their inability to reconcile their defensive narrative with emerging reality. They'd told themselves they needed space and were better off independent. But my extended silence challenged this narrative. If they were truly better off, why did my absence create discomfort? If they genuinely needed space, why did space that extended beyond their control feel threatening rather than liberating? The confusion revealed someone discovering their confident assumptions were built on the unstated belief that I would always remain available regardless of how they behaved. I learned through mutual friends that my ex began making uncharacteristic mistakes during this phase. Forgetting commitments, seeming distracted in conversations, appearing less put together than their usual carefully maintained presentation. These slips suggested someone whose internal processing was consuming cognitive resources they normally used for maintaining their defended persona. The confusion wasn't just about our relationship status, but about their entire self-concept. If their independence and emotional self-sufficiency were as complete as they'd always believed, why was my absence affecting them at all? This question began undermining the foundational beliefs their defensive structure was built upon, creating existential confusion that extended beyond just missing me into questioning who they actually were beneath their carefully constructed identity. Days 31 to 60. Panic and delayed processing. The middle phase of no contact brought the most dramatic shift in my avoidant ex's behavior and apparent internal state. Around the 1-month mark, when my silence showed no signs of ending, and they presumably realized I wasn't just giving them space, but had actually disengaged, their panic became visible to anyone paying attention. The most notable change was increased attempts at indirect contact. Their social media activity began, including content clearly designed for my attention, posts about regret, growth, therapy, missing important people, photos from places we'd been together, references to inside jokes or shared experiences. This content felt desperate in ways their earlier posts didn't, revealing someone who needed me to know they were thinking about me, but couldn't bring themselves to say so directly. Mutual friends reported my ex bringing me up more frequently, and with different emotional quality. No longer casual questions, but rather statements revealing they'd been thinking about our relationship, questioning their choices, wondering how I was really doing. They apparently asked one friend directly whether I'd started seeing anyone, revealing the specific fear driving much of their anxiety. The confidence they'd displayed in the first weeks had completely dissolved. During this phase, my ex also attempted more direct but still ambiguous contact. A text asking about something they needed to know that could easily have been resolved without my input. A voice message left accidentally that was clearly intentional. Each attempt was designed with plausible deniability. They could claim practical necessity or accident, rather than admitting they simply wanted contact. But the frequency and transparency of these attempts revealed someone whose defenses were cracking under the weight of extended silence. What I learned from friends was that my ex was experiencing their delayed emotional processing in real time. The feelings they couldn't access during the relationship, genuine missing, appreciation for what we had, recognition of their patterns, were finally surfacing now that the immediate threat of intimacy was removed. But these feelings emerged when I was no longer available to receive them, creating the tragic timing that defines avoidant attachment. The panic during this phase manifested in ways that would have been gratifying earlier, but felt almost sad from my new perspective of distance and healing. My ex apparently had a minor breakdown in front of friends, finally admitting they'd made a mistake and didn't know how to fix it. They'd Googled my name obsessively, checked my social media from fake accounts after I'd blocked them, and driven past places they knew I frequented, hoping for accidental encounters. This behavior revealed someone whose defensive structure had completely collapsed under the sustained absence of the person they'd taken for granted. But witnessing this collapse secondhand, I recognized it wasn't evidence of love finally emerging. It was evidence of loss finally registering. There's a crucial difference between someone missing you because they love you and someone panicking because they've lost control of a dynamic they depended on. Days 61 to 90. Grief, regret, and eventual reach out. The final month brought the culmination of the internal process I'd been watching unfold from distance. My avoidant ex's behavior suggested someone in full grief and regret, finally processing the reality of loss they'd created through their own defensive patterns. The performance of happiness disappeared entirely, replaced by posts and behaviors indicating someone genuinely struggling with what they'd lost. Around day 75, I received the direct message I'd been anticipating, not because I was waiting for it, but because I understood the pattern well enough to know it was coming. The message was long, vulnerable in ways my ex had never been during our relationship, and demonstrated genuine reflection about their patterns and their impact. They acknowledged specific behaviors that hurt me, expressed understanding of why I'd needed to walk away, and showed awareness of their avoidant patterns in ways they'd never accessed while we were together. But here's what was most revealing. Even in their vulnerability, they hedged. The message included escape clauses and qualifiers that revealed someone still operating from defensive position, even while ostensibly opening up. I understand if you've moved on. No pressure to respond. I just needed to tell you this. All language designed to protect them from rejection, even while taking the risk of reaching out. The vulnerability was real, but not complete, revealing someone who'd grown, but not transformed entirely. What struck me most about their eventual reach out was that everything they expressed, the appreciation for what we had, the recognition of their patterns, the genuine missing, was exactly what I needed to hear during our relationship. But receiving it 90 days after I'd disengaged demonstrated the cruel timing of avoidant processing. They felt everything when feeling it no longer served any useful purpose for reconnection, because I'd moved so far past needing their acknowledgement or return. The reach out also revealed they'd done some genuine work during the no-contact period. They mentioned starting therapy specifically to address attachment patterns. They referenced books about avoidant attachment they'd read. They demonstrated more self-awareness than they'd ever shown while we were together. But the work they described was preliminary, the beginning of a journey that would take years, not the completion of transformation that would make relationship viable immediately. What made their eventual message particularly poignant was recognizing that every insight they shared, every realization they'd come to, every piece of growth they described, was something I'd been telling them during our relationship. I'd named their patterns, suggested therapy, recommended those exact books, and tried to create space for the conversations they were now apparently having with their therapist. The difference was that now, processing these insights alone and through professional support The information landed in ways it couldn't when I was the source. This revealed painful truth about avoidant psychology. Sometimes they can only hear certain truths from neutral third parties rather than from the people actually affected by their patterns. My ex had finally arrived at awareness I'd been trying to help them reach for months, but they'd needed to lose me to be ready to receive information I'd been offering while present, what the 90 days actually revealed. This 90-day no-contact experiment revealed several crucial truths about avoidant psychology that theory describes but experience illuminates. First, avoidants don't process emotions in real time. Their nervous system requires safety that distance provides before they can access feelings that intimacy suppressed. By the time they process what they felt and what they lost, the person they're processing about has typically moved beyond caring about their delayed realizations. Second, avoidants are far more affected by loss than their initial behavior suggests. The relief and confidence they display early in separation masks anxiety and attachment they cannot acknowledge even to themselves. Extended no contact forces them past their defensive rationalizations into confrontation with genuine feelings they've been avoiding. But this confrontation happens on a timeline that rarely aligns with their former partner's healing and moving on. Third, even when avoidants reach the point of genuine vulnerability and acknowledgement, their defensive structure remains partially intact. The vulnerability comes wrapped in protective qualifiers and escape routes because their core fear of exposure and rejection hasn't disappeared even when they've recognized their patterns. Real transformation requires years of sustained therapeutic work, not just weeks of missing someone and reading self-help books. Fourth, the work avoidants do during no contact period, if they do any, is typically motivated by loss rather than by genuine commitment to growth for its own sake. They're working on themselves because they lost something they valued, not because they recognized their patterns were harming themselves and others, regardless of relationship outcomes. This distinction matters because loss-motivated change often reverts once the loss feels less acute or once they secure someone new. Another crucial revelation was understanding that avoidants often use the no-contact period to construct a revised narrative about the relationship that centers their experience and minimizes their responsibility. My ex's eventual message, while containing genuine vulnerability, also included subtle reframing of our relationship's problems that distributed blame more evenly than reality warranted. They remembered my reactions to their withdrawal, but not the withdrawal itself. They recalled conflicts we had, but not the patterns that caused those conflicts. This selective memory allowed them to feel remorseful about general mistakes, without fully confronting the specific ways their defensive patterns systematically harmed me. Recognizing this narrative revision helped me understand that even their growth and awareness remained filtered through defensive structure that protected them from the full weight of accountability their actions deserved. The decision point after 90 days. At day 90, I faced the decision point that anyone maintaining no contact eventually reaches: what to do with the information this experiment provided. My avoidant ex had reached out with apparent vulnerability, demonstrated some genuine work on their patterns, and expressed desire to reconnect or at least have conversation about what happened. I had to decide whether their delayed processing and preliminary work was sufficient foundation for giving the relationship another chance. What helped me decide was recognizing that while they'd made progress, they were still at the beginning of a journey that would take years. The vulnerability they showed was real but fragile, likely to retreat when tested by actual intimacy rather than the safe distance of text message sent after 90 days of no contact. The work they described doing was promising but preliminary, not the sustained transformation that would prevent repetition of the same patterns that ended our relationship. I also recognized that my own healing over those 90 days had progressed past the point where their acknowledgement held the power it would have had earlier. I'd built a life without them, processed my own patterns that kept me in unhealthy dynamic, and arrived at a place of genuine contentment and clarity about what I needed from partnership. Their return, while validating in some ways, didn't actually offer what I now knew I deserved: someone who could show up consistently without requiring loss to motivate their presence. The 90-day no-contact experiment taught me that understanding avoidant patterns intellectually is entirely different from experiencing them directly. Watching the predictable arc unfold, relief to confusion, to panic, to grief to reach out, provided clarity about whether reconciliation would serve me that no amount of research could have given. It revealed that my ex was capable of growth but not yet capable of the relationship I needed, and that their timeline for readiness would never align with mine, because their processing requires the very absence that allows me to move forward. The decision I ultimately made was to acknowledge their message with brief, kind response that didn't reopen the door to relationship. I thanked them for their vulnerability, validated that their growth journey was important regardless of our outcome, and wished them well while making clear I'd move forward with my life. This response felt right because it honored both their courage in reaching out and my own healing that had progressed past the point where their acknowledgement held power over my happiness. The most liberating realization was that I no longer needed their validation, their remorse, or their changed behavior to feel complete. The 90 days had given me something more valuable than their return. It had given me myself back, clarified my worth, and demonstrated that I could not only survive, but thrive without someone whose love required my absence to activate. Lessons beyond my specific experience. While this was my specific experience with my specific avoidant ex, the patterns I observed align remarkably with what research and countless others' experiences reveal about avoidant psychology and no-contact periods. The 90-day timeline seems to be the minimum necessary for avoidants to complete their delayed processing cycle. Shorter periods rarely penetrate their defenses sufficiently to create genuine confrontation with their patterns and their loss. The phases I observed, initial relief, growing confusion, panic and processing, eventual grief and reach out, appear to be relatively universal in avoidant responses to sustained no contact. Individual variations exist in timing and intensity, but the basic arc remains consistent because it's driven by how avoidant nervous systems process attachment and loss rather than by individual personality differences. What varies more significantly is what the avoidant does with their eventual realization and whether the person who went no contact is still available and interested when reach out finally comes. Some avoidants use the pain of loss to motivate genuine therapeutic work and sustain change. Others simply experience temporary discomfort that fades once they secure someone new, or once enough time passes that the loss feels less acute. Distinguishing genuine transformation from temporary discomfort requires time and observation that extends well beyond the initial reach out. The most important lesson from my 90-day no-contact experience is that it wasn't actually about my ex or what they did during that time. It was about giving myself space to heal, gain clarity, and rebuild my life without the constant emotional turbulence of their hot-cold patterns. What they did during those 90 days, their panic, their processing, their eventual reach out, mattered far less than what I did. Choose myself, maintain boundaries, and create life that didn't require their validation or presence to be fulfilling. Their delayed realizations became interesting data points rather than the determiner of my happiness or choices, which was exactly the shift no contact was meant to create. For anyone considering no contact with an avoidant ex, understand that the value lies not in what it does to them, but in what it does for you. The 90 days will likely follow predictable patterns on their end: relief, confusion, panic, possible reach out. But these patterns matter less than your own journey through grief, clarity, and rebuilding. By day 90, whether they reach out or not becomes secondary to whether you've reached a place where their reach out no longer determines your peace. The true success of no contact isn't measured by whether they come back changed, but by whether you emerge changed, clearer about your worth, firmer in your boundaries, and genuinely content with life you've built in their absence. That transformation, not their delayed epiphanies, is what makes the 90 days worthwhile.